third day of world's largest FinTech Fest, Global FinTech Fest, organized by Payments Council of India and FinTech Convergence Council of Internet and Mobile Association of India and National Payments Corporation of India. This fest is presented by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Government of India and Reserve Bank of India and supported by Niti Aayog, Startup India and Invest India. The second edition of the summit with the theme FinTech, Empowering a Global Digital Economy, will provide an in-depth understanding of the latest business, policy, investment and technology developments within the FinTech landscape globally. Data security and consumer trust in FinTech innovation. This is the wonderful topic that we are going to discuss here, and we have two amazing esteemed guests with us. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our session moderator, Mr. Sriram Chakravarti, partner Raja and Tan Singapore LLP, and Mr. Douglas Arner, Kerry Holdings Professor in Law, the University of Hong Kong. Firstly, good morning, both of you, and thank you very, very much. A warm welcome from all of us. And we're very excited for the session. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much. Very grateful and honored to be and to IMI and to all the other partners and the supporting organizations. My name is Sriram Chakravarti. I'm a partner at Raja and Tan. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this particular session, and particularly honored and very, very happy to introduce our guest for this session, Professor Douglas Arner, who's a Kerry Holdings Professor in Law at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Arner's resume reads very, very long. So I could spend the whole session just going through his resume and all the wonderful work that he's done, including his publications. But suffice to say, he is a preeminent expert in this area, dealing with FinTech, an area that's fast evolving. And he continues to be an expert talking about various aspects of data, FinTech, innovation, etc., but also looking at it from a global perspective. And I think that is quite phenomenal given the changes that are happening and especially kind of the convergence and divergence in this area that's happening. Professor Arner is also on the advisory board of Policy 4.0 as well as the Global Impact FinTech Forum. Prof, I don't know how you find time to do all of these. It's quite a huge workload. Prof, I want to jump straight in, given that we have half an hour for this session, and it's such a vast ocean in terms of coverage. And I want to refer to a recent publication that you've done, given that the topic of today's discussion of the session is essentially data security and consumer protection relating to FinTech innovation. And we would focus the next half an hour speaking about both data security as well as data securitization. And in that context, you just contributed a piece in the SSRN called the Transnational Data Governance Problem. And you call it a wicked problem. Let's get started with what is the wicked problem that is there and why should we be so concerned about this problem?
Thanks very much, Sriram. And I'd also like to say big thank you to Global FinTech Fest and congratulations on another amazing event. I'd also like to say I run one of the largest online FinTech courses, Introduction to FinTech, on the edX platform. And India always competes for our number one or number two market. So a big shout out to all of you who have done the course. Now, I think this topic of data is really core. If we think about the big issues of the next decade, data is one of the biggest of those issues. And I think one of the biggest challenges is we all know that aggregation of data has tremendous benefits. But we also realize that there are real questions, or we individually have real concerns about how our data is used. In other words, I want to benefit from the services that may be provided by a firm which aggregates mass amounts of data, but I want to make sure that my own data is only used for purposes that I can think of. And, if we think about major economies across the world, we're seeing different approaches to this question emerge. So, for instance, if you think about the traditional approach to data in the United States, which has dominated the tech industry over the past 2.5 decades, it's a property rights based model where essentially anyone can transfer their data to anyone else for just about anything. And the end result has been billions of people all over the world transferring their data to Google, Facebook, and others for a range of different services. And what that has enabled is the amassing of massive data pools, which those firms are then able to leverage across a range of different businesses. But at the same time, it raises concerns. In other words, is it something that we should care that a small number of companies own most of the data and that they are maximizing that data, yes, for us as customers, but they're also extracting the maximum benefits for themselves? And so this is, I think, a balancing question, and it's one that, if we look at Europe, has been a concern for a long time. And in Europe, we've seen the evolution of a different approach, a rights-based approach to data, which says that data is always mine, but I can allow others to use it. But it's always mine. I can always call it back. The challenge of that, though, is how do you go about getting these aggregation benefits? And so we see open banking. We see a variety of technologies that allow data sharing and data use. And if we look at China, for instance, China, until quite recently on the private sector side, has had a very similar approach to the United States, which has resulted in the evolution of big tech companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and others. But China, like the US, Europe, and India, other places, is having increasing concerns about dominance by a small number of companies. And so we're now seeing countries thinking about how can we maximize the benefits of data. And if we think about Europe, this sort of rights-based approach, if we think of the Chinese approach, essentially it is treating data as a shared resource, taking the data from the private companies, taking it into a state-owned vehicle and making it open to wider users. The US is still struggling. In India, we're seeing an approach with data aggregators. And so the big question is that as we think about not only data sovereignty, data competition, and data strategies, but also cross-border data, are these systems mutually incompatible? And that's actually what we're saying, is that data which is under EU rights-based rules probably can't move to China, probably can't move to the US. And this is fundamental to what we think about as globalization. And that is why we call it a wicked problem.
Thanks, Prof. It is truly a wicked problem, given that the problem is not something that comes up with immediate solutions or has some. It's easy to resolve because we are talking at a macro level. Here we're talking about competition, and we're talking about countries, and obviously data sovereignty, as you mentioned. So from what I get, just to summarize, in a sense, we have these three blocks: the US with its property-based, the EU with its shared right approach, and China with the EU with its rights-based approach, and China with its kind of shared resource approach. I read a recent article, in fact, published by the Bank of International Settlements, which spoke about regulating big tech, kind of going to the same point that you were talking about, saying, is there a shared resource? Are we concerned about small companies, or not small in a sense, but companies, a select group of companies monopolizing certain data that has been, entrusted to them? And should this be, in a sense, should we take a shared approach towards this data? And I'll just quote this. It's in the Bank of International Settlement. It offers certainly a different perspective, because what they talk about is that frameworks, and they're talking about essentially the EU, US, and Chinese frameworks, are starting to share many of the features relating to users' data rights that are enshrined in essentially the GDPR. And so, in a sense, the Bank of International Settlements feels that there's convergence towards the EU GDPR kind of approach, especially relating to protecting data rights. Are you seeing that as a trend at all at a global level?
Yeah. I think you do have these sorts of three different models. And as I said, historically, the US model has largely been dominant because of the role of US tech-based companies. And so it's sort of been embedded in the system. But if we think about countries outside of those three, the most influential from a legal standpoint has actually been the EU model. We see this in India, we see it in Brazil, we see it in an increasing range of the world, not least because it's attractive to most people, this idea of having control or rights over your individual data. It's also attractive because for countries that are not the US or China with their giant big techs, everyone else is worried about either how do you avoid being dominated by those firms, or how do you support the development of your own firms to be able to compete. And of course, if you think about the genesis, particularly of GDPR, these were some of the underlying policies. Now, if we think about the challenge of GDPR, the challenge is actually how do you say that individuals have control of their data, but then how do you actually make it usable for firms and others? And I think that this is where we're seeing some very interesting examples. We can think about the MyInfo system in Singapore, for instance. We can think about some of the initiatives in the EU around digital ID, decentralized data storage. We can think about in India, the data aggregators model. And I think that this is actually for countries that go with that model, the attraction. But if I want to then compare the US and China, the EU has already had a number of very significant court cases, the Schrems court cases, which say that the US framework doesn't meet EU standards and that therefore data transfers are not actually allowed. And so I think there is scope for the US moving closer to that EU approach over time, but it's not there yet. And actually, if you look at a lot of US efforts when it's talking about trade agreements, something where I think you have a familiarity, it's usually pushing for free movement of data. And that then conflicts with actually the requirements of an EU-based system. If we look at China, I think it's very important to differentiate between private sector and public sector use of data. And yes, I think China's new data protection framework, new data protection law, is heading towards an EU type approach for private use of data. But the Chinese government use of data is completely different. And I think at this point in time, there is very little chance that the EU would be willing to recognize the Chinese data framework, particularly when it comes to state use of data as equivalent. With that said, I think the BIS is right that in the context of financial data, where we already have a lot of cooperative frameworks, the issues may be a little bit easier than in this broader data context.
Well, I don't know how easy it is. I will share an anecdote from practice. I mean, I do this day in and day out, dealing with fund documentations, which is core of my practice. And just to share, in almost all the fund documents that we put together, now you're seeing clearly personal data protection clauses being entered. And these are not small clauses. They're almost kind of in the same vein as anti-money laundering clauses that you would flunk in, tax avoidance clauses. So it's almost reached a very important aspect that, you would look at. And the question is, depending on which jurisdiction, and if you're doing a fund transaction, the investors could come from different jurisdictions. The fund itself could be in different jurisdiction. You have administrators and service providers and managers who are in different jurisdictions. The end investment would go into another jurisdiction. And you now have to start looking at personal data protection requirements across all these jurisdictions. And to seek consent from investors, But two, when you're transferring that data for processing to, let's say, an administrator who's sitting in another jurisdiction cranking up all the NAVs, etc., you've just got to make sure that, that process is kosher. And you've captured that, and you've sought all the indemnities and acknowledgements and warranties that you need. And it's untested in a sense, because there's never been a case, and we don't know how that is. We always plonk the equivalence principle to say that if I'm transferring data from one jurisdiction to another, we will try and compare. But again, how do you do that in practical terms? You've just got to go with it. And so, I mean, as service providers, we draft up the documents, but I would just imagine if you're part of the fund administration team sitting there, you're probably scratching your head to try and find out whether the other jurisdiction has equivalent provisions as to the jurisdiction of the manager, or let's say the fund. So it is becoming quite an issue, and I would say fintechs would face the same thing, because I think, as you mentioned, another platform for finance, I think it's all about data now, and the movement of data is so pivotal for the fintech success.
What you've just highlighted, I think, highlights a couple of really important things. Yeah. Let me throw out a couple of things there. The first is, if I think about what are the big regulatory issues in financial services post-COVID, one of those is really data protection and cybersecurity. These are our most rapidly growing new areas of compliance. If we think about India and the massive role that India plays in back office IT and compliance, being able to develop systems and services where essentially they can assist corporations and financial institutions in managing data in a wide range of different jurisdictions and dealing with a plethora of different data requirements, I think has got to be a real growth area for many of those IT and compliance service centers. The third, I think, is really in the context of some trends that we're seeing in your last point around financial data. And one is that if we think about, there's been a trend all across the world of financial regulators requiring local storage of data, not just personal data, but financial data about financial institutions, so that in the event of any problem, regulators and supervisors have easy access to this data. And honestly, I think that the industry, in trying to argue against that, is on a losing track. What I think instead the future has to be is applying a wider range of federated learning techniques, decentralized analytics that allow you to analyze data in different places, regardless of where it may be located. And if I wanted to think about a potential growth area for fintechs and IT services companies, I would say this is one of those. The last, and I think that this is something we're seeing where it's beginning to bring all these pieces together, the biggest ride-hailing company in China called Didi listed on the New York Stock Exchange in July. And immediately after that, Chinese regulators basically cracked down. And the end result is that now any company listing from China seeking to list on a foreign exchange has to go through essentially a process of a cybersecurity review where its data are stored locally. And a challenge for this is in the context of auditors like the US regulators who are trying to access audit information, which is required as part of their listing process, and the fact that Chinese regulators no longer allow this. And I think this exactly highlights some of those challenges of competition and data sovereignty in finance.
In a sense, we've gone full circle. We've come back to the wicked problem, talking about data sovereignty. Prof, you've also in your paper highlighted some solutions to this wicked problem. You mentioned 3 approaches, and the one that I thought was very feasible was really the bilateral problem. And with fintech, in a sense, crossing borders, do you think there could be a solution with the bilateral approach that you proposed to further data sharing between countries? And how would that go? Any thoughts on that?
I think we're likely to see a number of trends. The first is that I'm expecting that the EU, China, and the US, as they look at future trade and investment agreements, will focus on embedding their approach to data into those arrangements, which is going to be a real challenge from the standpoint of third countries like Singapore, which would ideally like to enter into arrangements with all three, and whether or not it will be actually possible to structure accordingly. The second, I think, is going to be on the bilateral basis, where we have individual countries negotiating for frameworks. But at the end of the day, that's pretty time-consuming and inefficient if you end up having to have a different data transfer structure with every country that you do business with on a cross-border basis. And so I'm expecting that at least in some areas, finance, I think, is one where the G20, the Financial Stability Board, are likely to put in some effort to share information on cybersecurity issues. I don't necessarily know if they'll manage on data sharing issues, but I think at least from the standpoint of standardizing data. In other words, if you think about data that has to be disclosed, if it's standardized, even if it's stored and located in different places, the analytics are still easier. But I think some sort of global agreement, given the geopolitics and cultural and strategic differences, probably isn't on the cards.
I would agree. I think given the current political climate, I think there are other priorities, I would think, beyond data. But I'm quite confident, and I'm actually quite optimistic in terms of digital economy partnership agreements taking place, the bilateral approach that you said. And we're already seeing it from Singapore, that there is a move to have a deeper within ASEAN. There are also these agreements with Australia, and I think one that's proposed with Europe, with UK. So I'm optimistic that I think that might be the flavor, especially post-COVID, going ahead. Prof, I wanted to come back on a very particular point that you touched, which is really in terms of data aggregators. And I think this assumes particular relevance in a fintech context. Are you thinking that we could, in the future, not so distant future, have escrow providers who would essentially store data, aggregators of data, and then that would be a service that would be accessed by fintechs, by users, and in a sense, this would engender data security and consumer trust in provision of data. Are you seeing a trend, or do you see this taking off big time?
Yeah, that's honestly what I hope to see. I think we're seeing a variety of sort of competing models at the moment. One is the U.S. walled garden ecosystem, which doesn't want that to happen. A second is perhaps the Chinese approach, where you have national pooling of data. And the third is going to be around a variety of trust mechanisms. And you have quite a few people who are arguing that maybe banks could be data banks, trust frameworks. Or if you think about India in the context of the data aggregation system that is emerging there, or if you think about the wallets that emerged for KYC in the context of the India stack structure, these are exactly the same sorts of ideas. It's about using technology to give people mechanisms to safely store, but then provide access to others to use that data. And, I think this is hugely important because the benefits of data aggregation are really important. If we look at Ant, for instance, or we look at Amazon in the United States, both emerged as amongst the largest lenders to small and medium-sized enterprises. And we know that lending to small and medium-sized enterprises is a key economic goal. It's key to employment, it's key to GDP growth, it's key to innovation, it's key to empowerment of populations. But SMEs, because they're small and often they don't have good information, always have difficulties getting access to finance. We've tried lots and lots of different mechanisms, but what Ant and Amazon have both done is they have used massive pools of data, both their own, developed through transactions or payments or other sorts of aspects, to do real-time automated cash flow and reputational based lending of SMEs. And this has dramatically increased access to credit by SMEs in China. And this is what we want. But what we don't necessarily want is a single company controlling all of that data. And so I think this idea of a system where you have licensed aggregators, and after all, this is a trust function, and then you build frameworks that allow those aggregators on a sort of basis to allow access on permission to others to that data is potentially very, very powerful. Where it's a challenge is in countries which don't have the technological infrastructure to make things happen. I think this is something where India is really leading the way through the Aadhaar, UPI, and other sorts of processes in building that technological infrastructure. But many other countries, it's going to be a big, big challenge to make it happen.
Completely agree. And other than the technological infrastructure, I think the legal infrastructure has to be in place as well to allow for data aggregators and these kinds of escrow services to be provided. I think we look forward to the Indian Data Protection Bill and what's going to come based on that to see how this will be, if India would probably lead the way in data aggregation services and other services that would be tremendously useful for the fintech community, I would think, and overall for private and public infrastructure relating to data services. We're almost at the end. We've had a fabulous conversation. You lose track of time when you're having a great conversation. Don't have many questions. Any final thoughts, Prof? We've started with the wicket problem. We've come quite far. We've given some solutions, both at a macro level as well as at a micro level. Any final thoughts before we conclude the session?
You know, something that this discussion has made me think about is when we think about these systems, generally we're talking about how you do it nationally, and then you're sort of talking about cross-border integration. And, you know, when we think about sort of the data aggregators model in India, it's very much domestically focused. But if one can make that system work, it actually could work from an export standpoint. In other words, basically, if you can have systems whereby an aggregator is judged to be able to provide services for data aggregation that meet the laws of other countries, this is something where it's potentially an attractive service. The challenge, of course, would be doing that remotely, but so long as you can manage a variety of offshore data centers that are located in other jurisdictions, it's a potentially very interesting next stage export model built on areas where India is already competitive, the sort of financial services back office, and leveraging the domestic infrastructure for competitiveness internationally. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting possibility.
And I can look at possibilities where it'll solve a lot of pain to the problem that I mentioned, because then all you would have to do is refer to this escrow service provider, and he deals with all the issues relating to equivalence as well as transfer of data. And you don't need these long clauses in these agreements. We might be able to shorten them and reduce pain for the end clients. So, well, there is a very optimistic note. Thank you very much, Prof. Excellent hearing your thoughts and your valuable insights. been a real pleasure having you on this platform and at FinTech Fest. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sriram. Really enjoyed the discussion. And thanks to everyone for the invitation to be here today.
It is absolutely our pleasure, sir. Thank you very, very much for your time and a wonderful discussion. And hope to see you soon. And please try and attend all the other sessions whenever you have the time. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Bye now.
All right, on that note, such a wonderful discussion, such esteemed guests that we just had. So stay tuned for other sessions and we will see you in the next session. Meanwhile, please take care and thank you so much for joining.